The movie begins with a bunch of teenage boys digging holes in the middle of the desert. Just then, one of the boys walks toward a rattlesnake. His friends warn him not to get any closer, but he doesn't listen to them and is eventually bitten by the snake. In the next scene, a boy named Stanley Yelnats, aka the Fourth, is walking through the town when a pair of sneakers falls on his head. He doesn't think much about it and decides to take the sneakers home. But a while later, the police show up and arrest him for stealing the shoes of a famous baseball player, Clyde Livingston. When the police bring Stanley to his parents, they're startled to see a range of shoes in his home, while his parents are trying to find a cure for smelly shoes. The cops, on the other hand, don't understand what to make of this and believe Stanley is a shoe fanatic who steals sneakers. Stanley's family believes that their ancestors' mistakes cursed them to be unlucky, which is why tragic incidents like this continue to happen to them. Meanwhile, the judge orders Stanley to go to a juvenile correctional center named Camp Green Lake, where he must labor for 18 months. Stanley arrives at the location, only to discover that there's no lake and the place is in the middle of the desert. There he meets Mr. Sir, the camp supervisor, who gives him work clothes and instructs him to dig a hole every day. Stanley's also told that he might get a day off if he discovers anything interesting inside the holes. Meanwhile, Dr. Podansky, the camp psychologist, shows up and introduces himself. He then takes Stanley to other boys who only respond to their nicknames: X-Ray, Armpit, Squid, Zigzag, Magnet, and Zero. Apparently, Zero got his nickname because he never speaks to anyone, meaning that nothing's going on in his head, and he's a zero. However, during lunch, when Stanley reveals the cause for his detention, Zero speaks up and asks whether the sneakers had any red crosses. Later that night, Stanley has a vision of his great-great-great-grandfather, Stanley Yelnats I, who began the family curse. The man earned a fortune in the stock market, but he was robbed by Kate Barlow, a lady who used to kiss people after killing them. He was then abandoned in the desert for several days without food or water. Stanley I had previously worked as a pig farmer and had fallen in love with Myra, his owner's daughter. Therefore, Stanley seeks advice from the local fortune teller, Madame Zeroni, who urges him to forget about the girl and move to America because that is his future. However, Stanley's so in love that he doesn't listen to her at all. He goes to the girl's father and asks for her hand in marriage, but he's refused because another man is offering a large pig for Myra. Brokenhearted, he returns to Madame Zeroni to ask for help. Zeroni then hands him a piglet and instructs him to carry it up to the mountain every day so that she can drink from the stream. Stanley does as he's told, and when the pig is big enough, he goes back to Myra's house and asks for her hand in exchange for the pig. When Myra's father gives her the choice between Stanley and the other old guy, she becomes confused and is unable to make a decision. At that moment, Stanley felt that Myra is just stupid and not worth the effort. Therefore, he tells her to marry the old man and leaves the pig as a wedding gift before moving to America. However, he forgets the promise he made to Madame Zeroni to take her up to the mountain so that she can drink from the stream. As a result, Zeroni curses the entire Yelnats male lineage forever. Back in the present, Stanley discovers a fossil while digging, and hoping to get the day off, he gives it to the doctor. But the doctor tells him to keep digging since the warden is not interested in any kind of fossil. One day, Stanley gets into a fight with another boy, but fortunately, X-Ray intervenes. He warns them to stop fighting because if the warden finds out, they'll have to work double shifts. And since that day, Stanley also gets his nickname, the Caveman. While digging, Stanley discovers a tube casing with the initials KB written on it. When he shows it to the others, X-Ray grabs it and says he'll deliver it to the warden. He shows it to the doctor the next day, who then informs the camp warden about it. The camp warden turns out to be a woman named Lou. When she asks X-Ray of where he found it, he says that he found it in a hole while digging. Then she gives him the day off and orders the other boys to dig the same hole that X-Ray was digging earlier. But since the tube wasn't found where X-Ray was digging, even after digging for days, the boys can't find anything. Another flashback shows the flourishing Camp Green Lake in the 19th century. Kate Barlow is a school teacher who's in love with a vendor named Sam, who sells magic onions that keep lizards and snakes away. However, Kate is approached by a wealthy man named Walker repeatedly, but she rejects him every time. One night, after seeing Kate and Sam kissing, Walker, along with the townspeople, burned down the schoolhouse. Kate approaches the sheriff for help, but he informs her that Sam will be executed soon for breaching the law. Then, in front of Kate, Sam is shot in a boat by Walker's men. A few days later, she returns to the sheriff's office and shoots him to seek revenge for Sam's death. and before leaving, she kisses the dead man on the cheek. She's thereafter known as the Kissin Kate, an outlaw who robs and murders people. In the present, some guy steals Mr. Sir's sunflower seed sack, but Stanley gets the blame and is presented in front of Lou. But instead of punishing Stanley, Lou hits Mr. Sir for distracting the boys from their work. Meanwhile, Stanley notices posters in Lou's office depicting the search for missing Kate. When he returns to work, Stanley finds out that Zero has already dug his hole for him. Appreciating the friendly gesture, he offers to teach Zero to read and write. In the following scene, Stanley teaches Zero how to read and write some letters. During their discussion, Zero discloses that his real name is Hector Zeroni. It turns out that he's a descendant of Madame Zeroni, who cursed the Yelnats family many years ago. He also tells Stanley about his mother, who abandoned him in the park and has not returned ever since. In the end, they make a deal that Zero will help Stanley dig the hole every day so that he'll not be too tired to teach him. One day, Zigzag mocks Stanley and they start fighting with each other. While they're at it, Zero grabs Zigzag's neck and almost kills him, but they're stopped by the doctor. Just then, Lou arrives at the scene and finds out about the fight, as well as Zero and Stanley's arrangement. When he informs Stanley that the teaching must stop and they must dig their own holes, Stanley replies that he wants to continue teaching Zero because he's very smart. After that, the doctor mocks Zero by saying that a stupid person like him is suited only for digging. Irritated by the doctor's comments, Zero strikes him with a shovel and runs away. Next, we see Lou, the doctor, and Mr. Sir discussing what to do with Zero. Lou mentions that she wants to erase every trace of Zero's presence and wants to leave him in the desert to die. On the other hand, Stanley is devastated that his only friend is gone. He remembers how his ancestor, Stanley I, survived 16 days in the desert after Kate Barlow robbed his carriage. His grandfather told him that Stanley I found salvation at God's finger, but he doesn't know where that is or what it is. Therefore, he believes that Zero will find a way to survive as well. The next day, Stanley goes to the desert and screams for Zero, but he receives no response. Being impatient, he steals the camp's truck to go find Zero, but he accidentally drives it into the hole. Having no options now, he decides to get out and starts running. After traveling for some time in the desert, he eventually finds Zero hiding under a boat that once belonged to Sam. He persuades Zero to return to the camp and ask Lou for forgiveness, but Zero refuses to go back. Suddenly, Stanley observes a thumb-shaped mountain in front of them. He remembers his grandfather's story about how Stanley I discovered God's thumb and survived 16 days in the desert on his own. Then the two of them start climbing the mountain, but Zero becomes ill halfway up. So Stanley carries him up the mountain, fulfilling his ancestor's promise to Madame Zeroni and breaking the family curse. They eventually reach the top and discover a source of water, along with wild onions that prevent snakes and lizards from biting them. On the other hand, Stanley's father also discovers an effective solution for the bad shoe odor by blending peaches and onions. The next morning, Zero admits to Stanley that it was his fault that Stanley was put in the camp in the first place. That day in the orphanage, he stole the shoes, unaware that they were being donated by a famous person. But when everyone started looking for them, he threw them off the bridge, causing them to fall on Stanley's head. However, he was arrested the next day after trying to steal another pair of shoes. Hearing this, Stanley simply responds by saying that it was their destiny and that it was their fate to meet in this way. In the meantime, Stanley's lawyer arrives at the camp and informs the warden that he's innocent and must be released immediately. However, since Stanley's not at the camp, Lou argues with the lawyer, claiming that she needs a court order first. Next, we see another flashback of Kate Barlow sitting on Sam's boat. She's approached by Walker, who's now bankrupt, and demands that she hand over the treasure. However, Kate refuses and tells him to dig for it, and soon after that, she dies from a lizard bite. Since then, the Walker family has been digging for centuries to find the treasure, but they've been unsuccessful every time. Now, Stanley and Zero reach the camp and start digging where he found the tube before. After some extensive digging, they find a box Kate stole many years ago. Meanwhile, Lou and Mr. Sir show up and order them to hand over the box, but a swarm of dangerous yellow lizards appear. However, the lizard does not bite the boys since they ate the wild onions earlier. Finally, at that moment, Lou reveals that she's a Walker family descendant and that her grandfather ordered her to dig holes every day when she was a kid. And now she's using the juvenile detention center to find the treasure that they never found. The next morning, the Attorney General and Stanley's lawyer arrive at the camp, accompanied by Texas police. Lou accuses Stanley of stealing, but Zero notices the name Stanley Yelnats in the box and states that it belongs to Stanley. It turns out that the treasure actually belonged to Stanley's ancestors and was robbed by Kate Barlow. Back at the camp, Mr. Sir, who's revealed to be a paroled criminal named Marion Savio, and Podansky, a criminal faking to be a doctor, are arrested. After a series of suspicious events, the Attorney General requests that the juvenile camp be placed under their authority, and they arrest Lou as well. Stanley and Zero are free to leave because Stanley is declared not guilty, and Zero's record is being erased forever. Later, for the first time in almost a century, it rains in Green Lake as they gaze in awe. Lou begs Stanley to open the box before leaving, but he refuses and leaves. Lastly, Stanley shares the treasure with his family and Zero at home, which contains diamonds, deeds, and promissory notes. Then they hire private investigators to find Zero's mother, who turns out to be looking for him as well. As the movie comes to an end, we see the two families living comfortably as neighbors. The end.